Our gospel reading for today comes from the Gospel of John, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This morning, I'd like to start with a little show and tell, and you can't see what I'm showing, so I'll tell you about it. What I have here is a few old buttons from the 1970s with various slogans. Now, here is one that I wore in college. It has a cow on it, and the cow is thinking and saying, "No nukes." I wore this paired with this other button with a nuclear power plant on it, and the nuclear power plant is thinking, "No cows." That got me some laughs in the 1970s. I also have some Moravian buttons. Let's see. This one says, "John Huss Power." This one was from a Moravian youth convocation that my older brothers attended in the late 1960s. And this one is from the convocation that I attended myself in 1975 in Bethlehem. And it says, "We are 5 loaves and 2 fish." Now that is a reference to the Gospel of John and of Luke and Mark and also Matthew. Jesus feeding thousands with only a tiny amount of bread is the only miracle included in all 4 Gospels. So we cannot overstate its importance to our understanding of Jesus. The basic details are consistent from gospel to gospel. There's a crowd of at least 5,000. The question arises, how will these people eat? An inventory of resources reveals only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And yet the people are made to sit down. Jesus gives thanks and the food is distributed. Everyone eats as much as they want, and the leftover fragments fill 12 baskets. This is the Jesus that all 4 Gospels want us to know. The Jesus who trusts God to provide for everyone's needs and beyond. The Jesus of superabundance. There is always more That being the case, have you ever wondered why they bothered to gather the leftovers? The theme of Convo 75 was "We are 5 loaves and 2 fish." And my button helps me remember that theme, and my faded photographs help me remember how much fun I had. But for more information, where did I go? The Moravian Archives. Sifting through a box of papers, mimeographs from wax stencils, if you please, I was reminded of the field trips, the discussion groups, and the Bible studies that kept us very busy all week. We learned about serving the ill, the elderly, the homebound. We learned about speaking for justice and environmental protection, about bringing Christ's love to people suffering in prisons and in hospitals and in our own families. We learned that Jesus distributes us like loaves and fishes to meet the needs of the world. There were more than 300 of us at that convo. That's a big number for a youth convocation, but it is not a lot to feed the world. Like the loaves and fishes, we were surely too small to meet the need. And yet, our convo leaders taught us that with the blessing of Christ, whatever satisfaction we might offer the world would be multiplied in superabundance. That was 49 years ago. 49 years. And speaking for the friends that I'm still in touch with who attended Convo 75, I can say that mostly we have tried to be those loaves and fishes, meeting the needs of the world. Besides at least one Moravian pastor, there is a radiologist, 2 school teachers, a physician's assistant, a stellar church youth leader, and that's just among my small group of friends, just off the top of my head. I think that for most of these folks, church took. Convo took. At least we grew up with a sense of mission and a sense of responsibility to serve. But still, 49 years ago, and life strikes its random blows. I've kept in touch with these Convo folks enough to know what some of them have been through. Abusive spouses, alcoholic parents, family dysfunction, divorce, tragic loss, coming out as gay and being rejected for it, and still they have gone on being the loaves and fishes. Meanwhile, they also suffer the emotional toll of their work. The impossibility of caring for every suffering patient, mending every broken heart, fostering success in every student. The frustrations as the helping professions change with the times so that doctors feel beholden to the financial end of the so-called healthcare industry, and teachers are forced to substitute testing for teaching. After decades in service, loaves and fishes may feel reduced to so many fragments. And then they ask themselves whether, as fragments, they can really be useful to anyone. Maybe they think, maybe we should just lie here on the grass while the crowd we have fed arises, satisfied from their meal, and moves on. The professional name for this fragmented state is burnout. One source, I can't vouch for the accuracy, but one source claims this word was coined in 1975. Maybe someone was first writing about burnout while Moravians ages 16 to 25 were in Bethlehem at convocation, learning to feed ourselves to the world. Another source defines burnout as progressive loss of idealism, energy, and purpose. Those words are written about the helping professions, but I think the phenomenon of burnout is much larger, and I'm pretty sure it's rampant in the church. Because church work, it can wear some people out. We feed the hungry, we clothe the naked, we visit the sick and imprisoned. And on top of that, there's organizational work. Volunteers keep the church existing as an institution so that it may continue feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and so on. And sometimes it's the organizational work, committee meetings and such, that burns folks out the fastest because it has the least immediate reward. Church leadership blogger Brian Dodd quotes one burned out volunteer who said, "I don't sense I'm making an eternal impact, and I don't know if what I'm doing is impactful for today. I feel like if I'm there or not, it doesn't make any difference." Couple this frustration with whatever random blows have struck that volunteer's personal life, and it's no wonder that the volunteer declares, "I just feel burnt out. I just want to go sit down." That is the sound of another fragment falling to the ground. It might also be the sound of someone thinking about leaving the church. Because wouldn't that be easier? When you're feeling like a fragment with nothing left in you to feed anybody, all who work and serve the church, we could all just give up and lie down on the grass while the crowd moves on. Except for the voice of Jesus in the Gospel of John, telling the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." In Jesus' eyes, there is no bread so broken that it cannot be of use, no fragment too small to nourish. So he calls the disciples to pick up the pieces. Notice that. Jesus cares about all those broken pieces, but gathering them is a job for the disciples. The hands of Christ bless us and give us to the world, but it is the work of the church to pick up our own broken pieces and help those who have served themselves into fragments to find wholeness again. Home Moravian Church is full of loaves and fishes. I see you in every pew and even out there on the internet. I see you, blessed and distributed by Christ. I see people who feed neighbors in Winston-Salem and around the world. I see people who serve through their daily work in helping professions. I see people who lie awake at night wondering how to do more to help hurting people. I see lots and lots of loving volunteers who give huge amounts of energy and time to the work of this church, even as they struggle with upheaval and tragedy and weariness in their personal lives. I see people who served for decades and now, because age makes physical service difficult, serve by tireless prayer for the ministries of the church. I rejoice over all the ways that home church members nourish the world. But feeding the world does leave loaves and fishes in fragments. And that means the church needs to offer more than endless volunteer opportunities. Christ's servants need rest and restoration. And if it's not available in the church, the most committed servants may eventually start looking for the exit. The fragments will be lost. And Jesus would have some very stern words for the disciples who let that happen. Professional literature suggests some ways to avoid burnout. Some of these should sound very familiar to the church. One is relationships. People are less likely to suffer burnout if they have strong connections with others and can share stories about their lives. The more home church can foster relationships, the more we will be a place of restoration. I pray that as we serve our neighbors, we also truly connect with one another. Another defense against burnout is personal growth, learning new things, serving in new ways. The church especially should offer opportunities for growth. I would love to know what more home church can do to help you grow spiritually, deepen your faith, help you make new use of your spiritual gifts. Delving deeply into spiritual work will keep us engaged and might even restore that fragile treasure called idealism. Finally, we cannot avoid burnout if we don't rest. Sabbath rest is not just God's desire for us, it is God's command to us. And I would welcome your ideas for how we can make church life more restful instead of more stressful. Last Sunday, I met a member at the door as we were leaving church together. We had a brief conversation which she has given me permission to share with you. She had just come out of the listening session with the community engagement team, a discussion of local needs that's part of a county-wide organizational effort. And I thought this member might be energized from being in the same room with people who share her passionate concerns. I thought she might feel empowered. And instead, she confessed to feeling tired, even exhausted. As she expressed it, there are so many needs that to hear them all named is overwhelming. And worse, the needs are not new, they're only greater. Even as we learn more and more about how systemic injustice has created structural inequities, the politics of the moment seem to advocate against addressing either the systemic injustice or the structural inequities. People of faith have struggled with injustice and inequities for a very, very long time. Ask any Old Testament prophet. But there are historical moments when entire cultures seem to suffer a collective exhaustion, and I think we might be there right now. And so while we need to keep feeding the world, we also need to keep asking, how can the church gather and save all these fragments? So, as Jesus says, that none may be lost. In that phrase, the word that Jesus uses for lost can be translated other ways. That none may be discarded, that none may be destroyed, that none may perish. Later in John's Gospel, Jesus will use the same word as he prays for God to protect his disciples. I protected them in your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost. Jesus trusts in God's abundance, but he also cares for what God gives him. Losing a few crumbs of bread may be no big deal, but losing people is a big deal. Bread there may be in abundance, but there is only one you, and you, and you. Jesus is not willing that even one of you should be lost, or discarded, or destroyed. Jesus is not willing that even one of you may perish. The Jesus who sends us out to feed the world is also the Jesus who cares for what is broken into pieces. We are 5 loaves and 2 fish, but we are also the disciples called to gather the fragments. The church that sent my convo friends and all servants of Christ into the world must also be the place where all the friends and all the servants return to find wholeness, because the whole world depends on it. Amen.